She was a respected sheriff. He was a loving husband, or so she thought. But one night, she walked into a scene so disturbing, so gut-wrenching, it sent her into a frenzy. Her husband wasn't just cheating. He was on his knees, between the legs of someone she never expected. Her own mother. And what she did next? It left the town in shock. Was it justice? Or pure revenge? Before we dive into this jaw-dropping case, make sure to subscribe to The Last Confession. We bring you the most twisted, unbelievable, and spine-chilling true crime stories every week. Hit that like button if you think justice was served. And let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her shoes? Now, let's get into it. They called her Becky, the town's first female sheriff, a decorated officer with a reputation for being tough, fair, and unshakable. The kind of law enforcer people trusted, the kind of leader they looked up to. But even heroes have secrets, and Becky Caldwell was no exception. On the surface, she had it all. A loving husband, a career that inspired young women, and the respect of a town that saw her as a symbol of strength. But inside, Becky was a woman at war with her past. Her husband, Jason Caldwell, was the kind of man people envied. Handsome, charming, always quick with a joke. The town mechanic, reliable, hard-working, the picture of the perfect spouse. He doted on Becky, stood by her side at every town event, and in the eyes of the community, they were the ideal couple. But in the quiet moments, when the uniform came off and the town's admiration faded into the silence of their home, Becky knew things weren't always as perfect as they seemed. Because love wasn't the foundation of their marriage, survival was. Long before she wore a badge, before she married Jason, before she became the person Oakwood admired, Becky was just a girl trying to escape the shadow of her mother. Linda Carlson was a name that still carried weight in town, though for all the wrong reasons. A woman who understood power, how to use it, how to manipulate it, and most of all, how to survive by any means necessary. Men were her currency. Influence was her game. And Becky had spent her entire life trying to prove she was nothing like her mother. Linda had been the kind of woman who knew how to make a man feel important, until he wasn't. She had a habit of moving from one relationship to the next, each one a stepping stone to something better. And as Becky grew up, she watched, she learned, and she resented. The town knew Linda as a single mother who did what she had to do to get by. But Becky knew the truth. She knew the manipulation, the cruelty, the way Linda could tear someone down with just a few well-placed words. And worst of all, she knew the betrayal that no one else did. For Becky, leaving home wasn't just about growing up, it was about survival. She put herself through the academy, built a life, earned her badge, and promised herself she would never, ever be like her mother. And yet, even years later, Linda's shadow loomed over her, shaping her fears, her insecurities, and the choices she made. Maybe that's why she married Jason. He was safe. Reliable. The opposite of the men her mother had chased. A mechanic, a good man, someone who wouldn't leave. But what Becky didn't realize was that choosing a husband out of fear wasn't the same as choosing one out of love. So, from the outside, she was the woman who had it all, the perfect job, the perfect husband, the perfect life. But inside, she was still the girl who flinched when the past got too close. And in Oakwood, secrets don't stay buried forever. Because no matter how much Becky tried to outrun her mother's legacy, the past was about to come knocking. Sheriff Rebecca Caldwell had spent her entire life proving she was stronger than the woman who raised her. That she was different. That she was nothing like Linda Carlson. But in the span of mere seconds, everything she built came crashing down. It started as an ordinary night. A routine case had pulled Becky out of town, nothing major, just an overnight investigation. A stolen truck, a few witness interviews. She had told Jason not to wait up. But something in her gut had told her to come home early. A whisper, a nudge, an instinct she didn't quite understand. She pulled into the driveway just after midnight. The house was dark, save for a faint glow from the upstairs window. Jason had probably left the television on again. She sighed, exhaustion settling in her bones, and quietly unlocked the front door. The air inside was still, heavy. A strange kind of quiet. Something felt off. At first, she thought nothing of it. Maybe Jason had fallen asleep with the TV on. But as she set her keys on the kitchen counter, she heard it. A sound. Soft. Rhythmic. It came from upstairs. Becky froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The kind of sound that didn't belong, that didn't fit, that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Slowly, cautiously, she moved toward the staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, like wading through thick, invisible mud. The closer she got, the clearer the sounds became. A moan. A whisper. A name. Jason's. Becky's blood ran cold. Her pulse quickened. She gripped the banister so hard her knuckles turned white. Step by step, she moved forward, propelled by something between dread and disbelief. The bedroom door was cracked open just an inch, enough for a sliver of light to spill into the hallway. Enough for her to hear everything. Then, she saw it. Her husband. Her mother. Together. The world tilted. The floor vanished beneath her feet. For a moment, her brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. She stood frozen, breath locked in her chest, her vision tunneling. Jason's hands. Hands that had held her, comforted her, promised her forever, were now on Linda. Linda, the woman who had tormented her, belittled her, made her feel small. Linda, the woman who had taught her what betrayal looked like. Becky felt something inside her snap. A deep, primal rage, white-hot and all-consuming, surged through her veins. Her hands clenched into fists. Her nails dug into her palms, sharp enough to draw blood. Her jaw tightened until her teeth ached. She bit her lip so hard she tasted copper, felt the warm trickle of blood slide down her chin. A single thought pounded in her skull. No. She would not let this happen. She would not let Linda win. She would not be powerless. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, she lunged. The door burst open with a force that rattled the walls. The shock on Jason's face was instant, his body flinching as if struck by lightning. Linda barely had time to turn before Becky was on her. Fingers wrapped around her mother's throat. A gasp. A struggle. Jason yelled, but his voice was distant, drowned out by the roaring in Becky's ears. All she could see was Linda's face, those same calculating eyes, that same smirk she had worn Becky's entire life. Even now, as she gasped for air, Linda didn't look afraid. She looked amused. Like she had won. Rage became strength. Strength became action. Becky's grip tightened. Linda choked, clawing at Becky's arms, but Becky didn't let go. Couldn't let go. Every cruel word, every manipulation, every betrayal, this was justice. This was payback. Then, Jason's hands were on her, yanking her backward. Becky, stop. His voice shattered the moment. She stumbled, her breath ragged, chest heaving. Her vision blurred, dark spots creeping at the edges. Linda gasped, coughing, rubbing her throat, but her eyes never left Becky's. They held something dangerous. Something victorious. Jason stepped between them, arms raised, as if trying to keep two wild animals from tearing each other apart. Becky, listen to me. But she wasn't listening. She was unraveling. Betrayal burned through her, a sickness she couldn't contain. Her entire world had been a lie, and now she was standing in the ashes. Jason tried to speak again, but Becky didn't hear the words. Didn't want to. She turned and walked out. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. Because if she did, she wasn't sure what she might do next. Some moments change everything. Not just for a night, not just for a season, but forever. This was one of those moments. Becky Caldwell had been a woman of control, of composure. A sheriff. A leader. A protector. But in that bedroom, in the presence of the two people who had just ripped her world apart, something inside her cracked. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. 1 second, Jason was speaking, his voice a desperate, stammering mess, and the next, Becky's hands were around his throat. Jason's breath cut off instantly. His eyes bulged, hands flailing, clawing at her grip. Becky's grip tightened. Every ounce of betrayal, every second of deceit, funneled into her fingers. Jason gagged, his face turning red. Then purple. His legs buckled, his balance failing. His lips parted in a strangled, soundless plea. And just as quickly, Becky released him, only to drive her knee into his groin. A sharp, wet gasp escaped his lips as he crumpled, his body folding like a marionette with cut strings. Linda screamed, her voice shrill, cutting through the air like a blade. Becky turned. Linda moved, bolting for the door, but Becky was faster. With one swift motion, Becky grabbed her mother by the arm and swung her backward, slamming her against the dresser. The wood cracked. Linda yelped. A picture frame shattered to the floor. Jason was still on the ground, writhing, hands clutching himself as he gasped for air. "Becky, please," he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." But Becky wasn't listening. The rage was an ocean now, swelling, rising, crashing inside her with an unstoppable force. Her fingers brushed her belt. The cold metal of her handcuffs met her touch. A second later, she had Jason flipped onto his stomach, his wrist snapped into a cuff. Before he could react, she locked the other to the bedpost. "Becky," he tried again, yanking against the restraint. It didn't budge. "Baby, let's talk about this, please." Becky ignored him. Her movements were automatic now, as though she were still on duty, still the sheriff, still in control. Except this wasn't control. This was something else. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled her Glock from its holster. The weight of it in her hand was familiar. Comforting. She raised it, pointing it between the two people she had once trusted most in the world. Jason's breathing grew ragged, tears spilling down his cheeks. "It was just once," he sobbed, shaking his head frantically. "I swear to God, Becky, just once. I was drunk, I wasn't thinking. I love you, I love." Becky didn't move. Didn't blink. Her eyes shifted to Linda. And Linda smirked. A slow, deliberate curl of her lips. As if this had been the plan all along. As if this moment belonged to her. Becky's finger twitched on the trigger. For the briefest second, the room stood still. A single pull. A single choice. A single moment to end them both. But she didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she did something else. Something colder. She reached for her radio, pressed the button, and spoke into the receiver with eerie calm. "This is Sheriff Caldwell. I need officers at my house immediately. I just caught my husband committing a crime." Silence followed. A static pause. Then, the dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy that, Sheriff. Sending units now. Are you in danger?" Becky exhaled, her eyes never leaving Jason's. Now Becky stood in the middle of the room, her breath steady, her gun still in hand. The silence stretched, thick with tension, until the distant sound of sirens cut through the night. Jason whimpered from where he lay shackled to the bedpost. Linda sat on the floor, rubbing her wrist, her expression unreadable. The blue and red glow of police lights flooded through the window. Moments later, heavy boots pounded up the porch. A firm knock. Then. "Sheriff Caldwell, this is Deputy Hensley." "Open the door." Becky exhaled slowly, then placed her Glock on the dresser. She turned, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Hensley and two other officers stood there, hands on their holsters. They took one look inside, Jason in cuffs, Linda's disheveled state, Becky standing still, and exchanged a glance. "Sheriff?" Hensley asked cautiously. "What happened here?" Becky's voice was calm. Measured. "My husband was committing a crime. I detained him." Hensley's eyes flicked to Jason, then back to Becky. "We need to take your statement." Before Becky could respond, Jason let out a sob. "She attacked me. She lost her mind," she just snapped. His voice cracked as he turned toward the officers. "Please, you have to arrest her." Linda, ever the performer, gasped dramatically. "She tried to kill us," she wailed. She's been under so much stress, you know how the job is, but this was terrifying." Becky's hands curled into fists at her sides. Hensley hesitated. "Sheriff, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us for questioning." Becky nodded once. Understood. Minutes later, she was in the back of a squad car, staring out at the house she had once called home. The initial investigation painted Becky as the aggressor. Reports were taken, photos captured. Jason and Linda played their roles to perfection, Jason, the wounded husband, Linda, the concerned mother-in-law. Becky remained silent. But then, the forensic team arrived. And the truth began to unravel. Phone records revealed months of secret messages. Witnesses, neighbors, a bartender, even a motel clerk, came forward with statements. Linda and Jason hadn't just been having an affair. They had been together for nearly a year. And worse, there was blackmail involved. Jason had debts. Heavy ones. And Linda? She had been helping, financially, strategically. But Becky? Becky had been the insurance policy. The plan had been to manipulate her, to leverage her position. Becky wasn't the aggressor. She was the target. Days passed. The truth spread like wildfire. Linda's smirk faded. Jason's crocodile tears dried. The moment the evidence became undeniable, their stories crumbled. Becky was cleared. And Jason? Linda? They weren't just exposed, they were arrested. Betrayal had a price. And justice was finally served. The courtroom was a spectacle. Cameras flashed, journalists filled the gallery, and the town that once revered Sheriff Becky Caldwell now watched her fate unfold with eager anticipation. This wasn't just a trial. It was an event. At the center of it all, Becky sat motionless, her face unreadable. The prosecution had painted her as an unstable woman, a jealous wife who let rage take over. The defense countered that she had simply snapped, a crime of passion, not premeditated violence. The key witnesses? Jason and Linda. Jason took the stand first. His voice was meek, his demeanor that of a broken man. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he told the jury, eyes downcast, hands fidgeting. "Linda, she manipulated me. She used me. I was terrified of her, but I was too weak to stop. And Becky, she misunderstood everything. I love my wife. I never wanted this." The courtroom murmured. Some scoffed. Some pitied. Then came Linda. Dressed in a conservative suit, her hair neatly pulled back, she walked to the stand like a seasoned actress stepping into her biggest role. She sniffled, dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue, and took a deep, trembling breath. "I never wanted to hurt my daughter," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Becky, she has always had a temper. Always so controlling. I tried to protect Jason from her, but that night," she shuddered dramatically. That night, she nearly killed us." More murmurs. Becky's lawyer leaned forward. "Mrs. Carlson, would you say you have a history of manipulating men?" Linda gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Absolutely not. Is it true you and Jason carried on an affair for nearly a year?" "I was weak. He was weak. But that doesn't justify what Becky did." "Is it true you financially supported Jason and planned to use Becky's position as sheriff to cover up his crimes?" "Objection," the prosecutor snapped. "Speculation." "Sustained," the judge said, but the damage had been done. The jury was watching Linda differently now. Becky never spoke. She never looked at her mother. She barely acknowledged Jason. Her silence spoke louder than any testimony. Narrator. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the media outside spinning theories. Would Becky Caldwell walk free? Would she be convicted of attempted murder? Then, the verdict. Everyone stood as the foreman read the words aloud. On the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. A murmur. Some gasps. Others nodded. On the charge of attempted murder, not guilty. Silence. Becky exhaled, the smallest flicker of relief crossing her face. The judge's gavel struck. "Sheriff Caldwell, you are sentenced to 1 year of probation." 1 year. No prison. No handcuffs. No chains. A second chance. Linda's mouth tightened. Jason slumped forward, running a hand through his hair. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse, shouting questions, demanding statements. But Becky? She simply walked out, past the flashing cameras, past the chaos. She didn't look back. Justice had spoken. And now, it was time to move forward. Justice? Or did Becky get off too easy? Some say she should have faced a harsher sentence. That rage, no matter how justified, should never take control. Others argue she showed restraint, that Jason and Linda got exactly what they deserved. But what about you? If you came home to find your spouse with someone else, someone you trusted, how would you react? Some say cheating is just cheating. But what happens when the betrayal isn't just about infidelity? When it cuts so deep it shakes the foundation of who you are? Becky Caldwell's story is one of love, betrayal, and consequences. But in the end, the law has spoken. Was justice truly served? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you love gripping true crime stories, don't forget to subscribe to The Last Confession. We'll be back next week, with another story that will make your jaw drop.